So one of the first cool things that I've been doing this year is using two different 808s in each of my beats, at least two, sometimes it's more. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to the 14 drum kit and just pick a couple of 808s that I like. Can't get enough of that. Let's just do something like that. And that'll just add a really unique texture to your low end that I've heard in a lot of trap and pop beats lately. Add some effects to this loop. All right, so the second part of this is the type of 808 bounce that you program. And by that, I just mean that you want to start with something that's not going to trip you up so you can keep your entire workflow moving. So I've noticed that this particular pattern seems to be very common and it also tends to work for me as well. So I'll kind of show you what I mean as I set up both of my 808s. Simple. So I'm actually getting a little bit ahead of myself, but this is basically what the pattern would look like. Like very simple. And if I were to make it even simpler, it would look something like this. And setting your envelope is really, really important for when you're doing your 808s in general, but especially when you're doing two 808s, because that allows you to control how long your 808 plays by the note length. So they won't bleed into each other. So if you want to set up your 808 like that, just don't really overthink it too much. Come to the miscellaneous functions, no envelope settings tab in your channel rack settings for whatever instrument that you're trying to do it for. So it was for this 808, for example, you'll just turn all these knobs down, except for hold, which you'll turn all the way up. And I think this other 808 is already set up like that. Yep. So what I'm going to do is program the rest of my drum pattern, then come back and fill in this 808 pattern. Now that I have something that's just basic, it fits, it matches all the notes, I'm going to fill out everything else and then see how I can complement the rest of the drum bounce with, you know, remaining 808 fills and stuff like that. And so something else, just as I'm programming my drums, because I tend to do this to my hi-hats a lot and my hats in general, is I'll add shift to these, but I'll also add shift to my 808s just because it adds a nice swing to the overall bounce of the beat. Just a subtle amount of swing on my 808s just to push it off grid just a little bit. And I'll even add a little bit to my kick. That's nice. One of those things that's felt rather than heard. Okay, so now that that's all set up, I can go back in and see where I can fit in some 808 fills just to make this drum pattern a little bit more spicy overall. Okay, cool. So now we can bring everything into our mixer and talk about the last few things which have to do mostly with mixing. So we'll just go ahead and take all this and route it to our drum bus. Check out the last mixing guide. I'll have it linked in the first line of the description below, where we talked a little bit about signal flow. And then in the description of that video, there will be a link to another guide that is specifically about signal flow if you want to learn more about buses, sends, and a whole bunch of engineering magic that will make your beats sound a little bit cooler. So basically, we're going to route all of this so we can control all the effects of every single drum in one consolidated track. We'll add this little drum bus preset that I have. And so the first thing we're going to do before we get into talking deeper about signal flow is talk about how I like to EQ my 808s. Oops, I want to make sure that's routed to this track only. So it's not sending any signal to the master. The drums are not. They're sending signal to the drum bus, which will then send signal to the master. So the first thing we want to do is, for one, I start my leveling with my 808s anyway. So we can talk a little bit about 808 leveling. I tend to have them hit around 6. -6 dB, that is. But the thing that I really want to talk about is the types of EQs that I'll do. So I'll just open up a neutron so I can do this. So I will pretty much always do a low pass of some kind on most 808s, just to roll off a little bit of that high end. And that's difference making over time because it has less of those artifacts clash with your melody. And people tend to not do this because they want their 808 to like shine and be more present, and those high end artifacts add to the 808's ability to do that. But there's a couple of other things that I'm going to talk about that will help your 808 do that more than just like not mixing it correctly. So this has like a lot of high-end mid-range stuff going on, so I just like to roll that off a little bit. Not all of it, of course, because your 808 still gets character from that. And then the other thing I'll do, depending on what kind of 808 it is I'll also do a high pass right here at like something like 24 decibels, nothing too sharp, and I'll have it like around 20-ish, 25, 30 hertz, just to cut out some of the very, very low end trash from muddy 808s like this. Not every single 808 is going to need that, but that's going to be something that makes your 808 sound super clean when they're coming through like other speakers and stuff. That's one of the very subtle things that ruins mixes that a lot of people don't catch. Not tightening up that low end when you've got like a very muddy 808 can really fuck up the overall mix. So if your mix is really, really bad and like it sounds like your low end is just blowing stuff out, that might actually be a good thing to check out, is just clean up some of that high end and the low end if you need to, and then just re-level it. Because changing that EQ is going to change where it hits. So just make sure you get it hitting wherever you have your reference points at. And that's one of the most helpful 808s that I can, or one of the most helpful things I can do to my 808s in terms of mixing to just make them sound better. I don't tend to do it a lot for this particular 808, but even just a little bit might be helpful. And you'll see why more so in a second. Cool, so let's level everything else in. So there are a few other things that I'll do in terms of mixing to make my 808 sound, with the goal of making my drum sound better in general, but it has the effect of making my 808 sound really good too. So a basic one is just the drum room verb send, and this just adds a little bit of ambiance to your overall drum signal. So if you've got the bus where all the entire signal is already consolidated, you can just add a reverb. So this is basically the settings that I use for the send to get some reverb on my drums. So I'll just consolidate the whole signal into a bus. Again, check out the signal flow guide, which will be linked below if you want to learn more about signal flow, sends, and buses and stuff like that. I'll route it over to the send, but I won't route to this track only because what I want is a copy of the bus, not to reconsolidate the bus signal. And what this is doing now is adding a little bit of reverb to that signal, which is going to add width. So the reason I have all my low end stuff right now off is because it's a little bit difficult to hear how much of an effect the reverb is having when I have the low end going. but the goal is to have just a little bit of that reverb hitting on the 808 to make it sound a little bit more wide. So we do that, first of all, with this EQ, which will make sure it's not, you know, reverbing any of those low end frequencies, or any reverb that's being put on there is ultimately being EQ'd out. You can even take it one step further, honestly, and add an EQ before the reverb. And just make sure like no dirty, you know, low end stuff is going to be coming in regardless. And that still sounds like super reverb. So I'm just going to work on the settings a little bit. I'm going to turn down the dry and then just turn down the mix. Just, I want a very slight, subtle sprinkle of width on my drums. That right there is nice. That's very nice. So it's a very subtle thing that it's probably going to be difficult to hear unless you're really paying attention, but this will add a lot of body and width to your 808 without you having to push up the volume, destroy your mix, and a bunch of other stuff. And that allows you to do things like those EQs, the low passes and the high passes, without worrying about losing presence with your 808. Just make sure you don't cut too much of the low end, too much of the high end. Another thing I'll do is create another send, but specifically only for my 808. So with this specific send, what I'm doing is I'm creating distortion. So it's very similar to what we just did with the 808 send. But what I'm doing here is I'm just adding a bit of distortion. I have a bunch of other stuff that's on this preset, but none of this really matters. It's not really doing anything that's as important, but I'll still go through all of it. What this is it's equalizing. So again, I'm not trying to add distortion on any of those low end frequencies. I really only want to add distortion on the high end frequencies. So even before anything comes into this neutron console, which is on the distortion send, I'm just making sure there's no low end trash coming through. It'll make it easier on the console. And then I'm using this exciter, which is basically just a distortion or a saturation plugin. It allows me to add more character and more color to whatever signal that I'm sending through it. And these are the settings for that. And so this is a stereo shaper, and this is just the settings that I have for it. And that again creates on the duplicated signal of the 808s that are being sent to this track. It's going to add more width, which is going to create the perception of presence for my 808s or whatever else I happen to send to this signal. And this is just an Ozone 9 spectral shaper, which, to be honest with you, I can't remember what I used it for when I made this preset. But grab the Centerfold drum kit if you want that preset and a bunch of other good stuff. They're really, really good. But here's the settings for that. So that's all that good stuff. So here's what that sounds like. Here's what it sounds like with nothing routed to that so far. Good stuff, good stuff. Now we're gonna route this first 808 here. Maybe decrease the send signal to that. I don't need so much of that one, but I like that a lot. Then maybe we can send the second one. That's hard. That's hard. That's hard. That's clean. So one more thing that I like to do, and honestly, this last tip is more of a just add random stuff that sounds good. Every producer is gonna have, like, for example, I've heard a lot of really good producers say when you find like one really good bass patch, don't change it because it's hard to find a good bass patch. Just use it over and over again, which is why you'll tend to hear like a lot of talented producers kind of just use the same certain types of sounds. Not always, but there tend to be like a particular set of sounds they go to over and over again. So I'll just show you one thing that I tend to do to my 808s a lot when I want them to sound a little bit thicker. It just depends on what I'm going for. I wouldn't necessarily do it in this beat, but I just want to show you. So like this Son of Man 808, I can just take Radiator. Radiator is one of my favorite plugins ever. Soundtoys makes a lot of good stuff. And I'll just add this. this drum puncher preset. It's very subtle, and then turn the noise off. And it just makes it sound a little bit thicker in the mix. It'll compress it a little bit, which will require me to raise the volume just a little bit. All right, so there you go. A bunch of cool stuff that I've learned in 2023 that has made my 808 sound better. If you want to learn how to program 808s and drums overall, check out this tutorial appearing on your screen right now. I'll see you there. Peace.